You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Lucas Ashford didn't believe in mistakes. He believed in control, in power, in winning. But as he sat in the middle of New York's most exclusive penthouse, drowning in champagne and ego, he had no idea that tonight would ruin him. The room smelled of whiskey, money, and arrogance, where billionaires gambled fortunes like they were pocket change. But this wasn't about money. This was about pride. "You wouldn't last 6 months with a woman who doesn't worship you," Derek sneered, leaning in. "I bet you won't even make it that far." Lucas smirked. "And if I do?" Derek's grin widened. "Then you prove love is nothing but a contract." Lucas took the bet, because love wasn't real. But months later, as he stood alone, heart shattered, life in ruins, he realized Derek had been right. He didn't last 6 months. He didn't even last 6 weeks. Lucas never backed down from a challenge, especially not one that made him look weak. Derek leaned in, eyes glinting. No models, no influencers, someone you'd never be caught dead with. The men around them chuckled, watching for Lucas's reaction. He didn't flinch. "Fine," Lucas said, setting his glass down. "I'll marry whoever you pick." Derek smirked. 6 months. No backing out. Lucas extended his hand. "Done." The moment they shook hands, Lucas thought he had already won. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that he had just handed his life over to the only woman who would ever break him. And in just a few months, he wouldn't be the man on top of the world. He'd be the man on his knees, begging her to stay. The crowd cheered, toasting to Lucas's inevitable victory. But somewhere, in the back of his mind, something felt wrong. Derek watched him with an amused expression, too amused. Lucas should have paid attention to that look, because somewhere across the city, Amelia Carter was about to enter his life, and she was not the kind of woman who lost. Lucas thought he had set the rules of this game, but in 6 months, he'd be the one playing by hers, and by then, it would be too late. Amelia Carter had never believed in fairy tales. She had spent her life being judged, underestimated, and dismissed. People looked at her and saw curves instead of confidence, softness instead of strength. But that had never stopped her. At 29, she had built her own life, a successful bakery, loyal customers, and a sharp wit that could cut through steel. She wasn't waiting for some rich man to rescue her. She was doing just fine on her own. So when Lucas Ashford walked into her bakery one afternoon, expensive suit and arrogant smirk in place, she barely spared him a glance. "1 black coffee," he said, sliding his card onto the counter like a man who had never heard the word no. Amelia took one look at him, unimpressed. "We don't do billionaire specials here." Lucas blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, pouring his coffee without bothering to meet his gaze. "Rich men love their overpriced espressos. We do real coffee here." For the first time in his life, Lucas Ashford was ignored. And that was exactly why she was the perfect target. Lucas had closed billion-dollar deals in seconds. This should have been easy. "Let's get to the point," he said, setting down his untouched coffee. "I have a business proposal for you." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "You want to franchise my bakery?" He smirked. "No, I want to marry you." Silence. Then laughter. Amelia laughed in his face, loud, unapologetic, unbothered. Lucas clenched his jaw. No one laughed at him. "You're serious?" she asked, finally catching her breath. "Do I look like someone who needs a sugar daddy?" Lucas exhaled sharply. "No, but you do need money." Amelia's amusement flickered. Her mother was sick. The bakery was barely breaking even, but she masked it well. "You marry me," Lucas continued, "for 6 months. No strings attached. You'll walk away with more money than you've ever imagined." Amelia studied him, arrogant, unshaken, certain she'd say yes. "Let me guess," she said. "You think I'll fall for you?" Lucas smirked. "They always do." Amelia grinned. "Then let's make this fun." And she shook his hand. Lucas had expected hesitation, maybe a little fear. Instead, Amelia leaned back, calm as ever. 6 months, no strings, and I get paid up front." Lucas's smirk faltered. She was negotiating? You'll get half now, half at the end, he countered. Full payment, she corrected. I don't trust billionaires. Lucas studied her, then shrugged. Fine. Amelia signed the contract without hesitation, and that's when Lucas saw it. That smirk, not the nervous kind, not gratitude, a knowing, almost amused smirk. Something inside him twisted. Something funny? He asked. Oh, nothing, she said, tapping the paper. Just wondering how long it'll take for you to realize you just lost the biggest bet of your life. Lucas narrowed his eyes. What the hell was that supposed to mean? But he dismissed it. She was just another contract, nothing more. Wasn't she? It wasn't romantic, it wasn't emotional, it was a contract. Lucas Ashford stood at the altar, his jaw tight, his suit impeccably pressed. His guests were a mix of business associates, high society elites, and the occasional curious onlooker who had no idea what was truly happening. The vows were short, efficient, and devoid of love. Lucas didn't say anything that resembled commitment. He wasn't here for that. His mind was already on the next deal, the next goal, and this marriage would be over in 6 months. Amelia, standing across from him, barely blinked as they exchanged rings. There was no spark in her eyes. Her gaze was steady, almost disinterested. She didn't look at him with awe, like every other woman who had been swept into his world. She wasn't awed by his wealth, his status. She was simply going through the motions. And Lucas was perfectly fine with that. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that Amelia had already won. After the ceremony, Lucas led Amelia to the back of his penthouse. The lights of Manhattan flickered through the huge glass windows, but inside, it was all cold and impersonal, just the way he liked it. He'd expected her to be amazed, to be overwhelmed by his success. Instead, Amelia didn't even glance at the view. She didn't gasp at the expensive furniture or the luxurious art adorning the walls. She barely spoke. He led her to the living room, watching her closely. You'll get everything you need here, Lucas said, his voice smooth, but his eyes cold. The best of everything. Amelia raised an eyebrow. I'm sure. She replied, her voice calm, almost disinterested. But I don't need your things. I just need a roof over my head for 6 months. Lucas, stunned, forced a smile. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Women always fell at his feet. They always admired his wealth, always. But Amelia, she was different. She wasn't impressed, and that drove him insane. Days passed, and Amelia's independence was becoming clear. While Lucas worked, locked away in his office, Amelia spent her time alone. She didn't demand his attention. She didn't show up in designer clothes for every meal. Instead, she wore simple dresses like the ones she used to wear when running her bakery. She wasn't interested in his wealth. She didn't need it. She was strong, confident, and independent. One evening, Lucas tried to assert his dominance by taking her to an exclusive dinner at a Michelin star restaurant. As they sat down at the table, Amelia barely looked at him. She wasn't eager to hear about his day or ask about his business dealings. Instead, she took the menu and ordered something simple. You're a trophy wife, Amelia, Lucas said, irritation creeping into his voice. You're supposed to make me look good. You're supposed to be impressed by my life. Amelia set her glass down, meeting his gaze for the first time that night. I'm not here to impress anyone, and I'm definitely not your trophy. I'll live my life on my terms. You can control your business, Lucas, but not me. Lucas's stomach tightened. She wasn't just defying him, she was setting boundaries. Lucas tried everything: gifts, dinner dates, designer outfits, expensive vacations. He showered her with luxury, expecting her to eventually bend to his will. One morning, he placed a diamond bracelet in front of her. It was worth more than most people made in a lifetime. He expected gratitude, admiration, anything. But Amelia looked at the bracelet and then back at him, her face unchanged. I'm not interested in jewels, Lucas, she said coolly. I don't need to be bought. Lucas's jaw tightened. He had never been rejected like this. Never. He pushed harder. You don't understand, he said, his voice rising. This is what you deserve. Luxury, comfort, a life free from struggle. Amelia didn't look angry. She didn't argue. She simply shook her head. "I'm not a woman who needs your handouts. I've earned everything I have, and I don't need a man to give me things to feel valuable." It was then that Lucas realized she didn't want his money. For the first time in his life, he was being faced with a woman who couldn't be controlled by his wealth. And that was exactly what terrified him. Days turned into weeks, and Lucas found himself irritated, restless, and obsessed with the way Amelia was defying him. He tried to dominate her, he tried to buy her, he tried everything. But every time he tried to push her into his world, she refused to be manipulated. One night, after a long day of meetings, he walked into the living room to find Amelia reading a book on the couch, as if she didn't care about him at all. Lucas felt his chest tighten. He had never fought for a woman, but now he found himself wanting her to care, to notice him. He sat down next to her, determined to finally get through. "Amelia," he said, his voice calm but his hands clenched at his sides, "I'm offering you everything you could ever want." She didn't even glance at him. "I don't need everything, Lucas. I just need respect." Her words hit him harder than any business deal. She didn't want his money, his power. She didn't even need his approval. And in that moment, Lucas realized something. She didn't want him at all. And that realization stung more than he was willing to admit. Lucas had always been a man of control. But lately, he was losing grip. At first, he told himself that Amelia's presence was an inconvenience, just something to endure until their contract was over. He convinced himself that her refusal to bow to him was nothing but a challenge. But then, he started noticing things. She didn't just occupy space in his penthouse, she filled it with something different. Something warm, unshaken, unbothered by him. She never cared about his wealth, but she found joy in the simplest things, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the feeling of rain on her skin when she left the balcony doors open. Lucas had spent years in sterile perfection. His life was predictable, polished, controlled. But Amelia? She lived, she breathed, and she didn't need him. And for the first time in his life, Lucas didn't like being ignored. She wasn't just resisting him, she was existing without him, and that realization unsettled him. Lucas was always the center of attention. People catered to him, feared him, and followed his orders without question. But Amelia? She gave her attention to everyone but him. He saw it when she greeted the doorman by name, asked the maid about her children, and laughed with the barista at the cafe downstairs. She had a way of making people feel seen. Lucas had always dismissed warmth as weakness. But with Amelia, it wasn't weakness, it was power. One afternoon, he watched from his office window as she stopped to help a lost child in the lobby. The boy was crying, and without hesitation, Amelia knelt down, comforted him, and stayed until his mother arrived. Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent his entire life believing in control, that people should fend for themselves, that emotions were liabilities. So why did it bother him that Amelia was different? Why did her warmth feel like a challenge he couldn't win? Lucas was used to getting under people's skin. He was a master at manipulation, at bending people to his will. He could buy, intimidate, or seduce anyone into compliance. But Amelia? She stayed just out of reach. Even as he found himself watching her more, she never softened toward him. She didn't smile when he entered the room. She didn't seek his approval. And that bothered him. One night, as they sat in the same room, her reading, him pretending to go over reports, Lucas tried to push. "You don't like me, do you?" he asked, his voice casual. Amelia didn't even glance up. "I don't know you," Lucas smirked. "And whose fault is that?" This time, she met his gaze, calm, unreadable. "Yours," she said simply. Lucas expected irritation to flare in his chest. Instead, he felt something far worse. Confusion. For the first time, he wanted to know what she thought of him, and that realization made him feel powerless. Lucas had spent his life untouched by emotions. He didn't care about feelings. He cared about control. So why did it bother him when Amelia ignored him? Why did he find himself waiting for her to glance his way? One evening, after returning from a business meeting, Lucas entered the penthouse to find her laughing at a TV show. Not a polite chuckle, a real unfiltered laugh. It hit him harder than it should have. Something about it felt unfair. It wasn't that he wanted her to suffer, but wasn't she supposed to resent him? Instead, she was living her life freely, even in a marriage that was supposed to be a cold transaction. Lucas sat on the couch across from her, watching her out of the corner of his eye. And then she turned off the TV and left the room, without saying a word. That's when he realized something that terrified him. He wanted her to stay. The storm outside was relentless, thunder rolling, rain hammering against the windows. Lucas, restless, walked into the dimly lit kitchen to grab a drink, only to find Amelia already there, sipping tea. She looked up, but didn't speak. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair across from her. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the kind that should have been uncomfortable, but wasn't. Then, without thinking, he asked, "Do you ever regret saying yes?" She raised an eyebrow, surprised he had spoken. "Every day." Lucas smirked, but there was no humor in it. "That bad, huh?" Amelia shrugged, but there was something in her eyes, something real. "I knew what this was. I didn't expect it to be anything more." Lucas stared at her, a strange tightness in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wanted to say something real. Instead, he stayed silent. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if silence was enough. "I stopped believing in love a long time ago," Amelia said suddenly. Lucas frowned. "Why?" She let out a breath, staring at the tea in her hands. "Because people like me aren't meant for love stories." Lucas didn't like the way that sounded. "People like you?" She laughed softly, but there was no joy in it. "Women like me, who don't fit a perfect mold. We don't get the happy endings. We get the pity, the rejection, the judgment." Lucas felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. She was the strongest woman he had ever met. Yet here she was, revealing a wound even she couldn't hide. He should have let it go, should have reminded himself this wasn't real. Instead, he asked, "Who hurt you?" Amelia's lips parted slightly, but she caught herself. Instead of answering, she stood up. "It's late. Good night, Lucas." And just like that, she left him sitting there, staring after her. The next morning, Lucas found himself distracted. At work, during meetings, on phone calls, his mind kept drifting back to Amelia. Back to the way her voice had softened when she spoke about love. Back to the guarded pain in her eyes. Lucas had never cared about anyone's past. He never cared about anything beyond business. But Amelia wasn't business. She was something else. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Ashford wasn't sure what to do. That night, Lucas waited. Waited for her to enter the living room. Waited for her to sit across from him like she always did. But she didn't. She was pulling away, and suddenly Lucas felt something unbearable. Loss. And he had no idea why. The night of the charity gala was supposed to be like any other. The ballroom was bathed in golden light. The air filled with laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and whispered deals made between billionaires. Lucas Ashford was in his element, charming, calculated, untouchable. Amelia, however, was out of place. She had insisted on wearing a simple dress despite the designers Lucas had lined up for her. She didn't fawn over the elites or force smiles at strangers. She was there because she had to be, because the contract dictated she play the role of his wife. Lucas watched her from across the room, something in his chest tightening. She wasn't looking at him. She hadn't looked at him in days. Then, Derek appeared. "Lucas," he greeted smoothly, smirking over his glass of whiskey. "Still enjoying your little arrangement?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "Stay out of it, Derek." But Derek wasn't here to listen. He turned, his voice just loud enough to carry. "So tell me, Amelia," Derek said, swirling his drink. "How does it feel knowing you're nothing but a bet?" The entire room seemed to still. Amelia froze. Lucas's chest went ice cold. Derek grinned. "Oh, he didn't tell you?" Amelia slowly turned, her expression unreadable. But Lucas knew. Everything had just fallen apart. The weight of Derek's words hung in the air, suffocating, crushing. The entire ballroom watched, waiting for Amelia to react. Lucas stepped forward, ready to deny it, to fix it, to say anything. But Amelia didn't cry. She didn't gasp, didn't lash out, didn't make a scene. She just stood there. For a moment, Lucas saw something flicker in her eyes, something fragile, something breaking. Then, just as quickly, she buried it. She set her glass down on the nearest table, adjusted the strap of her dress, and, without a word, turned and walked away. The silence was deafening. Lucas felt panic slam into his chest as she moved toward the exit. "Amelia," he said, voice sharp, urgent. She didn't stop. He reached out, grabbing her wrist. For the first time since he'd met her, her touch was cold. She looked up at him, eyes unreadable. "Let go." Lucas hesitated, but in the end he did, because something told him he'd already lost her. By the time Lucas made it outside, Amelia was already walking down the marble steps of the grand venue. The rain had started, a light drizzle, making the city lights glisten against the pavement. "Amelia," Lucas called, striding after her. She didn't stop. He caught up to her, stepping in front of her path. "Let me explain." She tilted her head slightly, but she still wouldn't look at him, wouldn't meet his eyes. "There's nothing to explain," she said quietly. Lucas clenched his fists. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had prepared for fights, for arguments, for screaming, but not for silence. "I was going to tell you," he pushed, voice raw. I didn't think it would matter." Amelia finally turned her head, and the look she gave him cut deeper than any words ever could. "It doesn't," she said. "It never mattered, because this was never real." Lucas felt the breath leave his lungs. She walked past him, leaving him standing in the rain, soaking, furious, desperate. For the first time in his life, Lucas Ashford had no idea what to do. Lucas spent the drive home in silence. The driver didn't speak, the radio was off, and the only sound was the steady drum of rain against the windows. He walked into the penthouse expecting to see her, expecting a fight, a conversation, a reaction. Instead, he found emptiness. The bed was made too neatly. The closet door was slightly ajar, half empty, and on the nightstand where her books usually sat, there was nothing. Lucas stood in the doorway, frozen. She was gone. Not just for the night, not to cool off. Gone. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. This wasn't happening. She'd come back. She had to, didn't she? Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space where Amelia used to sleep. His mind was racing. He should have chased her down, should have made her listen. Should have. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. His stomach dropped. "Amelia?" He answered instantly. "Where are you?" But the voice on the other end wasn't Amelia. It was his assistant. "Sir, we have a problem." Lucas pinched the bridge of his nose. "I don't have time for this. It's about Amelia." The assistant interrupted. "She withdrew everything from the account you set up for her. She's erased herself from your world." Lucas's grip on the phone tightened. The room felt colder. She wasn't coming back. For the first time since the beginning of this contract marriage, Lucas felt something he had never felt before. Loss. And he had no idea how to fix it. Lucas Ashford had won. Technically. The 6-month contract was void. The bet was over. He was supposed to feel satisfied, victorious, untouched. Instead, he felt nothing. The first morning without Amelia, he woke up to silence. No sound of her moving around, no scent of her morning coffee filling the air. The penthouse felt wrong. At work, his employees congratulated him on another business deal, one that should have mattered, but the numbers blurred together. His signature on contracts felt mechanical. By the end of the day, he sat in his office staring at his phone, half expecting a message from her. But there was nothing. For the first time in his life, Lucas Ashford had everything. And yet, he had nothing. And that realization was more crushing than losing any bet. Lucas threw himself into distractions, business meetings, parties, nights at exclusive clubs, the things that used to define him. Women flocked to him, eager to fill the space Amelia had left. But they weren't her. One night, a model slid into the seat beside him at an upscale lounge, her manicured fingers grazing his wrist. "You seem distracted," she purred. Lucas forced a smirk. "I'm not." But he was, because for the first time in his life, he couldn't pretend. He excused himself early, ignoring the confused glances of his friends. As he stepped outside into the cold air, he felt something foreign. Regret. And for the first time, he admitted to himself, he had made the biggest mistake of his life. It started with small things, a laugh that sounded like hers across the street, a woman in a cafe with curly dark hair, wearing a coat that looked like the one she left behind. At first, he ignored it. Then he started looking for her. It was pathetic. He knew that. Lucas Ashford didn't chase women. But Amelia? She was different. One afternoon, he stepped into a small bakery, not hers, but similar. The smell of fresh bread and vanilla hit him like a punch to the gut. He almost turned around. Then, he saw a woman behind the counter, and for a second, just a second, he thought it was her. But it wasn't. His chest tightened. He left without buying anything, a strange weight pressing against him. She was everywhere, and nowhere at all. It was 2 a.m. when it finally hit him. Lucas sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the empty space beside him. It wasn't just that he missed her. It wasn't just that his life felt hollow without her presence. It was that he loved her. The realization slammed into him with brutal force. He loved the way she challenged him, the way she never let him have the last word. He loved her kindness, how she made strangers feel seen, how she never used people as stepping stones like he did. And he had lost her. Lucas pressed his palms into his face, exhaling sharply. When had this happened? How had he gone from a man who thought love was just another business deal to someone who had been utterly, completely ruined by it? And worse, what if it was too late? The next morning, Lucas made a decision. He was going to find her. He had resources, connections, money. Amelia couldn't have gone far, except she had. His first call was to his assistant. "Find out where Amelia Carter is, now." An hour later, he had an answer. "She's gone," his assistant said. "She closed her bakery, transferred money out of her accounts, and disappeared from the city. No forwarding address." Lucas's grip on the phone tightened. That wasn't possible. Amelia had walked out of his life so completely, so effortlessly, it was as if she had never been there at all. And the realization sent a chill down his spine. She hadn't just left. She had erased herself from his world. Lucas had thought he was in control. But now, for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. Lucas had stopped expecting anything. Weeks passed, and the silence was unbearable. No trace of her. No calls. No closure. Then one morning, as he sat in his office, his assistant walked in, a thick envelope in her hands. "This was delivered to the penthouse," she said carefully. "It's from Amelia." Lucas's heart stopped. He took the envelope, his fingers suddenly unsteady. The moment he saw the handwriting on the front, his throat went dry. He opened it with careful precision, pulling out a single sheet of paper. And when he saw what was inside, his entire world shifted. Lucas stared at the photograph in his hands. It was of a little girl. Dark curls, big brown eyes, soft, chubby cheeks. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. His breath came sharp and uneven. He turned the photo over. There was only one sentence written on the back. Lucas's hands shook. The words burned into his mind like a brand. "This wasn't just a bet for me, Lucas. This was my revenge." He stared at the words, reading them over and over, his pulse pounding in his ears. What did it mean? His mind raced through every possibility, but the answer was clear. The child. The girl in the photo. Was she his? Lucas's world tilted. His heart slammed against his ribs. Amelia had been planning something long before the bet, and suddenly, Lucas wasn't sure who had actually played who. Lucas stood, knocking over his chair. His assistant jumped at his sudden movement. "Sir?" Lucas didn't answer. He stared at the photo, mind racing. If Amelia had kept this from him, if this child was his, he needed to find her. Now, but a deeper, darker thought slithered into his mind. What if he had already lost them both? Lucas didn't hesitate. The moment he saw the photo, the moment he read the note, he knew what he had to do. For weeks, he had been drowning in regret, guilt, and emptiness. But now he had something worse than regret. He had questions. Was the little girl his? Had Amelia been pregnant when she left? Had she planned this from the beginning? Had he pushed away the only real thing in his life? His assistant had already given him the leads. A quiet town, a small bakery. He got into his car, driving through the night, past the city limits, past the life he had built on power and control, toward the one thing he had never truly understood: Amelia. And this time, he wasn't letting her walk away. The town was small, quiet, and nothing like the world he knew. Lucas parked across the street, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The bakery was warm and inviting, with soft golden light spilling through the windows, and there she was. Behind the counter, flour dusting her fingers, her hair pulled back, Amelia. She was smiling, not the polite, guarded smile she used to wear around him. A real smile. Lucas stood frozen. For weeks he had imagined this moment, her being miserable, missing him, regretting leaving. But this? She looked happy, and for the first time in his life, Lucas Ashford had no idea what to say. Lucas didn't move, didn't breathe. He watched as she handed a cookie to a little girl across the counter. A little girl with dark curls and big brown eyes. His stomach dropped. The child from the photo, the one he hadn't known existed. He felt like the air had been stolen from his lungs. But then Amelia looked up. Their eyes met. Her smile vanished. For a second he saw it, shock, hesitation. But then, her guard snapped back into place. She turned away like he was nothing, like he was just another stranger in the bakery. Lucas felt something crack deep inside him. She had moved on, and it shattered him. Lucas forced himself to step forward. The bell above the bakery door jingled as he walked in. Amelia didn't even look up. The little girl peeked at him, curious but cautious. Lucas's throat was dry. He had no idea what to say. "Amelia," he started, his voice hoarse. She wiped her hands on a cloth. "We're closed." It wasn't true. There were still customers in line. But she wasn't talking as a business owner. She was talking as a woman who had no intention of hearing him out. Lucas exhaled. "Please, just talk to me." She finally met his eyes, and there was nothing in them. No warmth, no anger, just emptiness. That hurt more than if she had yelled at him. "Whatever you came here for, Lucas, you're wasting your time." Then she turned her back on him. Like he had never mattered. Lucas didn't leave. He stood there, watching her move around the bakery, effortlessly, happily. She had built a life without him, a world where she didn't need his money, his name, or his presence. And the little girl? His daughter? She didn't even know who he was. Everything hit him at once. The bet, the lies, the countless ways he had hurt her. Lucas had always thought that money, power, and control meant everything. But standing there, watching the woman he had once taken for granted, he realized something gut-wrenching. He had never deserved her. And unless he did something drastic, he never would. Lucas wasn't going anywhere. He had spent years winning everything. But this wasn't about winning. This was about earning. And if that meant waiting, proving himself, humbling himself in ways he never had before, so be it. Because for the first time in his life, Lucas Ashford knew exactly what he wanted. Amelia. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get her back. The next morning, Lucas showed up at the bakery. He didn't walk in. He just stood outside, watching, waiting. The customers whispered. The employees stared. But Lucas didn't care. He was done pretending. Every day he came back. Some days he sat on the bench across the street. Other days he ordered coffee. But Amelia never spoke to him. Not once. Still he stayed. Because if there was one thing he knew, it was that he wouldn't survive losing her again. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of her pretending he wasn't there. Then, one night, as she locked up the bakery, she finally turned to him. "What do you want, Lucas?" she asked, arms crossed. Lucas exhaled. "Finally." "5 minutes," he said. "Just let me talk." She hesitated. Then, to his shock, she nodded. They sat on a bench outside. The night air was cold, the town quiet. Lucas swallowed hard. "I was an idiot," Amelia scoffed. No argument there. He almost smiled. Almost. But he wasn't here for jokes. He was here for her. "I never saw you," Lucas admitted. "Not really. And by the time I did, it was too late." Amelia stared at the ground. "And now I know I ruined the best thing in my life," he said, voice rough. "And I know I don't deserve another chance. But I swear, Amelia, if you let me, I'll spend every day proving how wrong I was." Amelia's hands tightened in her lap. "You hurt me," she whispered. Lucas nodded. "I know." She looked up then, eyes filled with something raw, something real. "And I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Lucas's chest ached, but he wasn't giving up. Amelia's voice was quiet. "How do I trust you again, Lucas?" He swallowed, his throat tight. "You don't, not yet, but I'll earn it." She shook her head, looking away. "And what if it's not enough?" Lucas exhaled. This was it, his last chance. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an envelope. Amelia frowned. "What is that?" Lucas held it out to her. "My company, my shares, my control." She stared at him. "What?" "I transferred them to a charity in your name," he said. "Every last one of them." Amelia froze. Lucas gave a small, sad smile. "I don't care about winning anymore, Amelia. I only care about you." Her hands shook as she took the envelope, and for the first time, Lucas saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. For the first time in his life, Lucas let go. He had built an empire by controlling every move, every deal, every outcome. But Amelia wasn't a deal. So he did the one thing that went against everything he had ever known. He walked away. "If you ever decide to give me another chance," he said, voice raw, "I'll be waiting." No begging. No manipulation. He turned and left her standing there, holding the envelope that contained everything he once thought mattered. But now, she held something more valuable. The power. Amelia had spent her life being the one left behind. By men who saw her as less than. By a world that thought love had a size limit. But Lucas had just given her the choice. No pressure, no expectations. For the first time, she had the power to decide. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, the proof that he had given up everything for her. The papers inside were real. His name was off every document, and he had walked away without asking for anything in return. For the first time, Amelia realized something terrifying. She missed him. Lucas expected the silence, but it didn't make it any easier. Every morning, he woke up hoping for a message, a call, anything. But Amelia was gone. He told himself he had done the right thing, that he had given her what she needed: freedom, choice, control. And if she never came back, then at least he knew he had loved her the right way for the first time in his life. But that didn't stop him from aching for her, from wishing he had more time, from wondering if he had lost her forever. The knock came just after midnight. Lucas barely hesitated before opening the door, and there she was, soaking wet from the rain, breathing hard. "Amelia," she said nothing, just stood there, her eyes searching his, looking for something she couldn't put into words. Lucas's heart pounded. "Amelia," he whispered. She exhaled, trembling, but not from the cold. She had made her decision, and suddenly Lucas was afraid of what it was. Amelia's voice was barely above a whisper. "I never stopped loving you, Lucas." Lucas's breath hitched. She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I just stopped believing that you loved me." His chest tightened. She had never doubted her own love for him. It was him she had doubted. Lucas swallowed hard, stepping forward. "You were right not to believe me back then." Amelia flinched. "But believe me now," he said softly. "Because I love you, Amelia. I love you in a way I never thought I could love anyone." She searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the man who had once made her a bet. She didn't find him, because he wasn't that man anymore. Lucas had never begged for anything in his life. But for Amelia, he would kneel. And he did. Right there in the rain, on the doorstep of his penthouse, Lucas dropped to one knee. "I don't have anything to offer you," he said, voice rough. "No contracts, no deals, no promises of a perfect life." He swallowed. "All I have is me, just me." Amelia's breath hitched. "I love you, Amelia," he whispered. "I love you without conditions, without rules, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if you let me." The rain poured around them, and for the first time, Amelia let herself believe him. Amelia knelt down in front of him. She reached out, placing a shaking hand against his cheek. "I'm still angry," she whispered. Lucas nodded. "I know. I'm still hurt. I know. I don't know if I can forget what you did." Lucas exhaled. "I don't expect you to." She stared at him, her heart pounding. But something had changed. She had spent months trying to convince herself she could live without him. But standing there, seeing the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that had ever mattered, maybe she didn't want to live without him. "Okay," she whispered. Lucas's chest tightened. "Okay, I'll try." And that was enough. For now, that was everything. Lucas and Amelia didn't go back to what they were before, because that wasn't real. Instead, they started something new. No contracts, no bets, no lies, just them. They took it slow. Lucas stayed in town, helping at the bakery, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He learned how she liked her coffee. She learned that he actually sucked at baking. They fought, they laughed, they fell in love all over again, this time for real. And when Lucas asked her to marry him, there was no contract, only love. The wedding was nothing like the first one. No business deals, no hidden agendas, just two people who had found their way back to each other. Amelia wore a simple dress, barefoot on the beach. Lucas, in a suit he had actually let her pick out, looked at her like she was the only thing in the world, because she was. "I do," Amelia whispered. "I do," Lucas said, voice raw with emotion. And this time, it meant everything.